we're going to be talking about some third-party games. Obviously, in our Direct Special, we talked about a bunch of them. However, there were some we missed out because we just had to get the content out very quickly. John was upset about not being able to talk about Fast Fusion, and I kind of get where he's coming from because this looks mega, right, Oliver?
Yeah. Well, I'll try to do justice to this one in some small respect without John here, but I think this looks awesome. Fast Racing Neo, awesome on Wii U. Fast Racing RMX, Fast RMX on Switch 2 was quite superb, or on Switch rather, was quite superb. It was actually the very first Switch game I played because it was only 500 megabytes. You could download it pretty easily on a portable hotspot, coming back from the GameStop and have a pretty good experience there. It combined, great materials, beautiful lighting, and a really wild sense of speed with really superb looking motion blur. And it had pretty high res rendering for a Switch 1 title, with a smooth 60 FPS update in both portable play and docked play. And Fast Fusion is following up on Fast RMX by also arriving on Switch 2 at launch. I think this just looks outstanding in the screenshots that they've published. One thing that stands out here is the scale of those trackside environments seem to have been increased a fair bit. You're seeing a lot more in the background and a much denser, I think, presentation in some of these backgrounds than in Fast RMX. And they're promising here up to 4K rendering with HDR, which is pretty cool too. Although I will say that image quality, maybe some interactions with some post effects here, not looking so hot always in motion, I would say. In the tiny portion of gameplay that we have, like literally I think it's 4 or 5 seconds. But yeah, this is a big one. I imagine John will be all over this one. It's also just a very exciting time to be a fan of arcade racers, because you have two big arcade racers, this and Mario Kart, on launch day to dive into and play for months to come, I'm sure. Plus F-Zero GX under emulation. And then, of course, Kirby Air Riders coming later in the year. Another big arcade racer for Nintendo. So Nintendo's really after my heart for this one, for sure here. So I'm really excited to see that, especially in a generation where we've not really seen too much in the way of arcade racers so far on PS5 and Series X and Series S. Dirt 5 was really the standout title there, and that was obviously a launch game. Came out 4.5 years ago. Not been a whole lot of movement since there on that front. So that's really exciting to me. I'm sure this is going to be a really great game.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Hyrule Warriors Age of Imprisonment, going from a super smooth experience to something that doesn't actually look that smooth.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
I thought this was a bit of a highlight here, or possibly a low light. Maybe just a bit of a reminder, possibly, that even though the Switch 2 is faster, some of these image quality concerns we saw in Switch 1 titles aren't necessarily always going to be solved by Switch 2, especially if you don't have like TAA in the mix or other kinds of techniques to hopefully clean up that imagery and make it suitable for presentation on a modern display. Here, Age of Calamity, Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity was an infamously poor performer in the original Switch, running at very low resolutions, running at low frame rates. And here, this looks like a pretty raw 720p 30 based on my counts. It looks roughly in that 30 FPS range as well. Based on my pixel counts, that's where it lands, possibly with FSR1 in the mix. I'm almost thinking, just based on the way the edges are a little bit smoothened out, it almost looks a little bit FSR1-ish to me, but maybe not a post AA. That's kind of the impression I'm getting there, possibly. I believe this is the Katana engine, which is used by Koei Tecmo for a lot of their games, most of their games, I think, at this point. And yeah, it just does not seem that well suited for Switch. Although, in fairness, the scale and the scope and the massive stuff they're trying to do in these Warriors games, that is definitely exceptional here. So perhaps people who are into these games will be able to overlook some of those faults. But yeah, image quality is definitely a concern for this one.
Yeah. And let's talk about, I think this one's quite surprising, to be honest. Star Wars Outlaws. This is like a technologically demanding game on the new Snowdrop engine from Ubisoft Massive. The concept that it's running on this class of hardware is pretty mind-blowing, I'd say. I'm curious what you think of it.
Yeah, I think this is a really exciting port, possibly an impossible port, if you will. It's a huge game. It looks great, especially on PC. But I think, ultimately the question that people are going to have here is what kind of features are on Switch 2 here? Because obviously this is a game that uses ray tracing on PC very extensively, on consoles very extensively, with ray traced reflections and RTGI. It is a very console-friendly ray tracing presentation there, and they have a lot of, very important GDC presentations on this that I'm sure Alex can talk about. But one note here, though, is that the footage they have here does look exceptionally good, I would say, like quite good.
Yes.
And
Yes.
it definitely looks like they have very effective indirect lighting, kind of RTGI-ish in this footage. But also, it is running at an unlocked frame rate in one shot, and then in the other shot, it's running at 60 FPS, and image quality also seems really good. So is that plausible for Switch 2, combining all those features together for this game? I don't know. And given that what we've seen with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3+4, I'm kind of, possibly throwing my hands up and saying, I'm not 100% sure about the provenance of this particular footage, but I'd be very curious to hear Alex's thoughts on this, because obviously he knows the engine very well. He understands this stuff quite deeply. He's very familiar with the ray tracing implementation in Snowdrop. So I guess, could you explain, Alex, is this at all plausible, and what kind of compromises would you see Ubisoft Massive possibly making for this game on Switch 2?
I think we would see very similar compromises that we saw for the Series S versions of this engine. There's a couple of things that they do on console anyway that I think some of them they might actually end up changing. Where, for example, one thing that they'll take advantage of that probably Switch offers, but we'll have to figure out in time whether or not, from talking with third-party developers probably behind the scenes, is whether or not they allow for offline BVH streaming. And this game on the consoles doesn't actually include any of like the world's dynamic elements that would be potentially moving greatly in the BVH structure as geometry. It's like a simplified version of the world, so they can cut out a lot of the time that you would take calculating a BVH in real time out of the equation by streaming a good majority of them from disk. That's something that they do on PS5 and Xbox One and Xbox Series X. All right. Sorry, Xbox One, I said. Sorry, Xbox Series S. And that's something that I imagine that they could be taking advantage of here would really help it out. But this footage, does, you can't really glean anything from that. And also the quality, like I remember counting it, I thought it was like 1080p native. I was like, this seems weird after looking at Cyberpunk's internal resolutions. And the quality in general. But another thing that they would do that they did on Xbox Series S, for example, was they have a world space trace that combines with probe tracing and screen space tracing. And if I'm not mistaken, the Series S version of the game actually gets rid of the world space trace completely. So in that case, and it does another optimization on top of that too, that I think you might end up seeing, like more lighting quality like we saw on Series S, which was actually, in some scenes, depending upon the scene, it could be a good deal lower than what you saw on the other consoles because it was essentially doing a slightly different RTGI technique. I would be curious, though, about stuff like reflections because the game doesn't have necessarily the perfect fallback for that. It's got like a rolling cube map that moves with your character. It updates like over a couple seconds. So I'd be very curious to see what reflections are like. But this is by far the most technically ambitious game that we've seen mentioned as having been ported to Switch.
Yep.
By far, it is cream of the crop. So this is probably going to be, for me, on a technical level, the most interesting thing that we'll see when it does come out.
Yeah, I think we need to stress just what we're talking about here. I tested Avatar Frontiers of Pandora on an Asus ROG Ally X, and you can play it at 30 frames per second, 720p. However, you have to run everything at lowest of the low settings to for that to happen. And so, the concept of this game running on the same engine, more demanding in some respects, I believe, I've got to see it. And that shot that they've got in the B-roll there of that vast, expansive view, that is going to be extremely expensive to render for a mobile piece of hardware. So, yes, I don't know. Maybe we can get a sort of plausibility rating in percentage terms there, Alex, of plausible versus shenanigans.
It's like halfway there.
50-50.
I'm just gonna be safe. I don't like saying super definite things on DF Direct because then I get quoted, and then
Yes.
there's like an article somewhere about
It will
me.
be no. There's tweets that just keep coming back.
Yeah.
Again and again and again. Shorn of the original context. Completely
it's the way it is.
devoid of the idea that, hey, maybe when new information comes along, we might change our minds.
Is this too big for Switch 2?
Is it too big for Switch 2? That is the question.
It's always a bit of a fraught exercise when we're judging seconds of footage, playing them on repeat and doing this also, so that plays into it as well, I imagine.
Yeah, it's funny.
Absolutely.